I never considered myself the type to strike up a conversation with strangers, let alone find myself in the middle of a protest. My days were predictable. Work at the auto shop, return to my small apartment, maybe watch some TV or read a little before bed. I liked it that way. Quiet, steady, no surprises. That's the life I was used to back in Jalisco, and it's the life I hope to keep here in the US. That night, though, things shifted. It was a Thursday, I remember, because that's the night the bar down the street offers cheap beer. I sat alone at my usual table, nursing a bottle, when she walked in. She wasn't like anyone I'd met before. Her name was Patricia. At least, that's what I overheard her say to the bartender. She was fiery, confident, and loud in a way that somehow wasn't annoying but magnetic. She had this energy, this way of moving and talking that made everyone turn to look at her. I don't know why, but when her eyes met mine, I froze. She smiled. Not a polite smile. Not one of those forced ones people give when they catch you staring. No, it was a real smile, like she knew something about me I didn't. Before I could stop myself, I nodded back. That was it. No words exchanged, nothing extraordinary. But I couldn't get her out of my head. The next time I saw her, it wasn't in a bar. I was heading home from work, and there she was, standing on the corner of Main Street, holding a sign. "Make new laws," it said in bold letters. There was a crowd around her, chanting and waving signs of their own. My heart raced. It wasn't just the shock of seeing her again. It was where she was and what she was doing. I shouldn't have stopped. I knew that. My work permit was legal, sure, but being anywhere near something like that could attract attention, and attention was the last thing I needed. But my feet betrayed me. I crossed the street, pretending to be interested in the taco truck parked nearby, just to get a better look. "Hey, you!" her voice called out, startling me. I wasn't sure she was talking to me until I looked up and saw her waving. Hi, I stammered, caught off guard. She didn't waste any time. "You work around here?" I nodded. "Yeah, at the auto shop on 5th. She smiled again, that same genuine smile, and extended her hand. "I'm Patricia. Nice to meet you, Mr. Mechanic." Gabriel Lopez," I said, shaking her hand. Her grip was firm, her palm warm. For the next few minutes, she spoke passionately about why she was there. She talked about human rights, about families being torn apart, about justice. I didn't say much. I couldn't. Her words were like fire, and I wasn't sure I wanted to get burned. But she didn't seem to mind my silence. "You don't have to agree," she said at one point, as if reading my mind. "But you're here. That says something." I didn't know what to say to that. I still don't. All I knew was that she was different. She saw the world in a way I'd never dared to. To her, every injustice was a fight worth taking on. To me, the world was something you survived, not challenged. The third time I saw Patricia, it was starting to feel like fate was playing tricks on me. The bar, the protest, and now, the grocery store. Of all places, right? I was staring at the shelves, debating whether to buy the expensive coffee I liked or stick with the cheap one, when I heard her voice behind me. "You look like a man trying to solve a serious problem," she said, and I turned to find her smiling at me, a basket of vegetables in her hand. I laughed awkwardly. "Coffee is a serious problem," she chuckled, and before I knew it, we were talking again. Easy, natural, like we'd known each other for years. I didn't expect to meet someone like her here, or anywhere, really. But there she was, showing up in my life like a persistent thread I couldn't ignore. The fourth time was at a park. I had taken my car to the shop on my day off, and while I waited, I decided to walk around. She was sitting on a bench, reading a book. I hesitated, not sure if I should approach, but she looked up and spotted me before I could decide. "Gabriel," she called out, waving me over. It was like she was genuinely happy to see me, and that did something to me. We talked for hours that day, and before I knew it, the words slipped out of my mouth. "Would you like to have dinner with me sometime?" Her eyes sparkled, and she said yes. Dating Patricia was like stepping into a world I didn't know existed. She was everything I wasn't. Fearless, outspoken, unafraid to take up space. I admired that about her. She made me feel things I'd long buried: hope, excitement, even a strange sense of safety, though I knew I wasn't really safe. One night, after a few months of dating, I decided it was time to tell her the truth. Not just the bits and pieces of my life I'd shared casually, but the real story, the one I never talked about. We were sitting in her apartment, the city lights casting shadows on the walls. She was curled up on the couch, looking at me with that curious, patient expression she always had when she knew I had something on my mind. "Patricia," I began, my voice heavier than I wanted it to be. There's something I need to tell you. Her brow furrowed slightly, but she nodded. I'm listening. I took a deep breath, gathering the courage I wasn't sure I had. Before I came here, I was a commando. In Mexico, part of the 36th Amphibious Special Forces Group. Her eyes widened slightly, but she stayed quiet, letting me continue. We did things, dangerous things. My unit was tasked with fighting the cartels. It wasn't just raids or patrols, it was war. Every day, every mission, it was life or death. And one day I lost. I was injured during an operation. A bad one. It left me unable to keep up with the demands of the unit. I paused, my throat tightening as I recalled the weight of that decision, the shame I'd carried for years. They let me go, honorably, but still, I wasn't a soldier anymore. Patricia reached out and took my hand, her touch grounding me. Gabriel, that must have been so hard. It was, I admitted. But it got worse. After I left, the cartel came for me. They wanted me to join them, to use my training, my skills, for them. And when I said no, well, you don't say no to them without consequences. Her grip on my hand tightened. What did you do? I ran. I said simply. I knew they wouldn't stop until they found me, until they took me out me. So, I left everything behind. My family, my friends, my country. I got a work permit and came here, hoping I could start over. That they wouldn't follow me. The room was silent for a moment, her gaze searching mine. I could see the questions in her eyes, the concern, but also something else. Something I hadn't expected. You're brave, she said finally, her voice soft but firm. Not just for what you did back then, but for telling me now. I shook my head. Brave would have been staying and fighting. No, she said, her tone leaving no room for argument. Brave is knowing when to walk away, when to survive. Her words hit me in a way I couldn't explain. For the first time in a long time, I didn't feel like a coward. I didn't feel like a man running from his past. I felt seen, understood, and maybe, just maybe, a little bit hopeful. Getting married to Patricia was a whirlwind, one that felt both surreal and inevitable. We weren't the type to follow conventions, but there was something about being with her that made me believe in stability, in roots, in the kind of life I never thought I'd have. We didn't want a big wedding. It was just a small ceremony at the courthouse, with a few friends as witnesses. She wore a simple white dress, her hair loose, and I remember thinking she looked like everything I'd ever wanted and never thought I deserved. When the judge pronounced us husband and wife, she grinned and whispered, "Ready for the adventure of a lifetime, Mr. Lopez?" I smiled back, the kind of smile that comes from a deep, quiet joy. "As long as you're by my side, Mrs. Lopez." For months after the wedding, we talked about what was next. Patricia's work as an activist kept her busy, but she was starting to feel burnt out by the constant fight. She loved what she did, but she confessed one night, lying beside me in bed, that she wanted something more grounded, something that felt like building instead of tearing down. "Have you ever thought about going back?" she asked softly, her head resting on my chest. "To Mexico?" I asked, though I knew that's what she meant. She nodded. "Your stories about Baja, it sounds beautiful, peaceful, and you've talked about wanting to open your own garage. Maybe it's time to stop running." Her words stayed with me. For years, I had buried the idea of going back, convinced that it was impossible. But now, with Patricia by my side, I started to wonder if maybe I could reclaim the life I'd left behind. Before we made any decisions, I knew I needed answers. I called my cousin Miguel, who still lived in Baja. Miguel had always been the kind of guy who kept his ear to the ground, knowing what was happening with everyone in town, and, more importantly, with the cartel. "Miguel," I said, my voice steady despite the nerves twisting in my gut, "I need to know if it's safe for me to come back." There was a long pause on the other end of the line before he spoke. "Gabriel, it's been years. The cartel doesn't care about you anymore. They've moved on. You're not a target. Not anymore." I exhaled, the weight of his words hitting me all at once. I wasn't sure if I believed him, but a part of me wanted to. Desperately. "You're sure?" I pressed. "As sure as I can be," he said. "Come home, Primo. It's time." Patricia and I packed up our life in the U.S. and made the long drive to Baja. Crossing the border felt like crossing into another life, one I hadn't seen in years. The air smelled different, richer somehow, and the landscape was both familiar and foreign. I pointed out landmarks to Patricia as we drove, places I remembered from my childhood, places I hadn't thought about in years. When we arrived in my hometown, it was like stepping into a memory. The streets were the same, but the faces were older, the colors a little more faded. My family welcomed us with open arms, and Patricia charmed everyone instantly with her warmth and curiosity. She tried speaking Spanish, stumbling over the words, but laughing at herself in a way that made everyone laugh with her. Getting married to Patricia was a whirlwind, one that felt both surreal and inevitable. We weren't the type to follow conventions, but there was something about being with her that made me believe in stability, in roots, in the kind of life I never thought I'd have. We didn't want a big wedding. It was just a small ceremony at the courthouse, with a few friends as witnesses. She wore a simple white dress, her hair loose, and I remember thinking she looked like everything I'd ever wanted and never thought I deserved. When the judge pronounced us husband and wife, she grinned and whispered, "Ready for the adventure of a lifetime, Mr. Lopez?" I smiled back, the kind of smile that comes from a deep, quiet joy. "As long as you're by my side, Mrs. Lopez." For months after the wedding, we talked about what was next. Patricia's work as an activist kept her busy, but she was starting to feel burnt out by the constant fight. She loved what she did, but she confessed one night, lying beside me in bed, that she wanted something more grounded, something that felt like building instead of tearing down. "Have you ever thought about going back?" she asked softly, her head resting on my chest. "To Mexico?" I asked, though I knew that's what she meant. She nodded. "Your stories about Baja, it sounds beautiful, peaceful, and you've talked about wanting to open your own garage. Maybe it's time to stop running." Her words stayed with me. For years, I had buried the idea of going back, convinced that it was impossible. But now, with Patricia by my side, I started to wonder if maybe I could reclaim the life I'd left behind. Before we made any decisions, I knew I needed answers. I called my cousin Miguel, who still lived in Baja. Miguel had always been the kind of guy who kept his ear to the ground, knowing what was happening with everyone in town, and, more importantly, with the cartel. "Miguel," I said, my voice steady despite the nerves twisting in my gut, "I need to know if it's safe for me to come back." There was a long pause on the other end of the line before he spoke. "Gabriel, it's been years. The cartel doesn't care about you anymore. They've moved on. You're not a target. Not anymore." I exhaled, the weight of his words hitting me all at once. I wasn't sure if I believed him, but a part of me wanted to, desperately. "You're sure?" I pressed. "As sure as I can be," he said. "Come home, Primo. It's time." Patricia and I packed up our life in the U.S. and made the long drive to Baja. Crossing the border felt like crossing into another life, one I hadn't seen in years. The air smelled different, richer somehow, and the landscape was both familiar and foreign. I pointed out landmarks to Patricia as we drove, places I remembered from my childhood, places I hadn't thought about in years. When we arrived in my hometown, it was like stepping into a memory. The streets were the same, but the faces were older, the colors a little more faded. My family welcomed us with open arms, and Patricia charmed everyone instantly with her warmth and curiosity. She tried speaking Spanish, stumbling over the words, but laughing at herself in a way that made everyone laugh with her. I found a small space on the edge of town, run-down garage with peeling paint and rusted tools. It wasn't much, but I saw the potential in it. With Patricia's help, I cleaned it up, bought some new equipment, and opened for business. "Taller Lopez," the sign said, painted in bright letters that Patricia insisted on doing herself. The first few weeks were slow, but word spread quickly. People remembered me, and even those who didn't were drawn in by Patricia's friendly smile and the promise of honest work. I poured everything into that garage, my skills, my heart, my hope for the future. 2 years into our new life in Baja, things weren't what I thought they would be. The garage was thriving. I'd built a reputation for honest work and skill, and people came from all over town to bring me their cars. For a man like me, that kind of respect and stability felt like a dream. But dreams, I was learning, don't always last. Patricia had changed. Or maybe I had, and we were no longer on the same path. At first, it was little things. She started complaining more often about the heat, the slower pace of life, the lack of what she called opportunities. She missed the city, the energy, the activism. I tried to listen, to understand, but it felt like no matter what I said, it wasn't enough. "You're wasting your potential," she said one night, her voice sharp as we sat at the dinner table. The food I'd cooked sat untouched on her plate. "You could have gone back to the States and done something bigger. Instead, you're here fixing old cars in the middle of nowhere." Her words stung, but I swallowed the pain. "This is what I've always wanted," I said quietly. "A place to call home. A simple life." "I thought you wanted that too." "I thought I did," she snapped, pushing her chair back and standing. But I was wrong. This isn't enough for me, Gabriel. I stayed seated, staring at the table as she walked away. The sound of the bedroom door closing echoed through the house. The weeks turned into months, and things only got worse. Patricia's words grew harsher, more cutting. She'd call me a loser, accuse me of settling for mediocrity, and scoff at the life we'd built together. "Do you even care about me?" she asked one night, her arms crossed as she paced the living room. "Or do you only care about your little garage and your old memories?" "I care about you more than anything," I said, my voice steady despite the ache in my chest. "I'm doing this for us, Patricia. I thought we were building a future together." She laughed bitterly. "A future? Here? This isn't a future. It's a dead end." I didn't know what to say to that. I couldn't understand how the woman who had once been so full of fire and passion had turned into someone so bitter, so angry. I wanted to believe it was just a phase, that she would come around. I told myself she was homesick, frustrated, maybe even scared. I clung to the hope that the Patricia I'd fallen in love with was still in there, somewhere. Every night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, replaying her words in my mind. I wondered if I'd failed her, if I'd been wrong to think we could make this work. But then I'd look at the garage, the life we'd built, and remind myself why we'd come here in the first place. This was supposed to be our fresh start, our chance to escape the chaos and find peace. I still loved her, even when she pushed me away. Even when her words felt like knives cutting into my heart. I believed in her, in us. And so I stayed. I worked harder, tried to be more patient, more understanding. I told myself that love was about perseverance, about weathering the storms together. But deep down, I couldn't shake the fear that the storm might not pass this time. That maybe, just maybe, Patricia didn't want to weather it with me at all. I started noticing the change in Patricia before I knew the reason behind it. She became distant, more than she already had been, and began dressing differently, wearing brighter clothes and more makeup. At first, I thought maybe it was a good sign, that she was finding herself again in a way that might bring us closer. But soon, her absences became harder to ignore. She started leaving the house at odd hours, saying she was meeting new friends or volunteering in the community. When I asked her about it, she'd snap, "Do you want me to just sit at home all day, Gabriel? Is that what you think I should do?" I'd let it go, telling myself that maybe she needed space, that maybe she was trying to find happiness again. It wasn't until I heard the whispers in town that I started to piece things together. People talked about El Flamboyant, the new drug lord who had swept into Baja like a hurricane. His real name was Enrique Valdez, but everyone called him by his nickname because of his outrageous displays of wealth. He'd show up at street markets in a convoy of luxury cars, tossing money to children and buying rounds of drinks for entire bars. I didn't think much of him at first. Men like Enrique came and went, and I'd spent most of my adult life trying to avoid their world. But then I started hearing Patricia's name in the same conversations as his. She was with him at the cantina the other night. A customer said casually one afternoon as I worked on his truck. Looked like they were pretty cozy. I froze, my wrench slipping in my hand. "Patricia?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. He nodded, oblivious to the turmoil his words had caused. "Yeah, she's been seen with him a lot lately. Guess he's got a thing for her." I didn't confront her right away. I wanted to believe it wasn't true, that people were just gossiping. But the signs were there, and once I started looking, I couldn't unsee them. The late nights, the sudden influx of new clothes and jewelry, the way she seemed almost happy for the first time in months, but not because of me. One night, she came home hours after she said she would, her hair tousled and her perfume heavy in the air. She barely looked at me as she walked past, heading straight for the bedroom. "Where were you?" I asked, my voice quiet but firm. She turned, her expression defensive. "Out. Why does it matter?" "Because I'm your husband, Patricia," I said, standing, "and I'm not blind. I know something's going on." Her eyes narrowed, and for a moment, I thought she might deny it. But then she crossed her arms and smirked, a cruel edge in her voice. "You want to know where I was? Fine. I was with Enrique." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. I stared at her, trying to process what she just said. "The drug lord?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. She laughed, a cold, bitter sound. "Yes, the drug lord. At least he knows how to live, Gabriel. At least he's not some small-town loser clinging to a dead dream." The house was suffocating, its walls closing in as I faced Patricia. She stood there, defiant as always, her arms crossed, her gaze cold and detached. The woman I had once loved so fiercely now felt like a stranger who had betrayed me in the worst way possible. "You're playing with fire, Patricia," I said, my voice steady despite the storm raging inside me. "Enrique isn't some charming rogue. He's a cartel boss. You think you're special to him? You're nothing more than a passing fancy, and when he's done with you, it won't end well." She rolled her eyes, her lips curling into a cruel smile. "At least he knows how to make life exciting. Unlike you." Her words were the final straw. I grabbed my jacket, slinging it over my shoulder. "You need to pack your things and leave. Go back to the U.S., Patricia. I'll file for divorce, and I want nothing to do with you after that. You've made your choices, and now I'm making mine." Without waiting for a response, I turned and walked out the door. Her voice didn't follow me, and that silence was almost worse than any argument we could have had. I ended up at a bar on the outskirts of town, one of the quieter spots where I could drown my anger and sorrow in a few bottles of beer. The place was dimly lit, with the faint hum of ranchera music playing from an old jukebox in the corner. I sat in the farthest booth, nursing my drink and staring into the glass like it held answers. The bartender gave me a sympathetic nod as he wiped down the counter. People here knew me, respected me. They didn't ask questions, but they knew when a man needed space. I was so lost in my thoughts that I didn't notice the black SUV pull up outside. The sound of screeching tires barely registered before the doors slammed open and chaos erupted. The first crack of gunfire sent people scattering, screams echoing through the bar. I dove behind the table, but it was too late. Pain exploded in my chest, a burning, searing agony that stole my breath. I hit the floor, clutching the wound as blood seeped between my fingers. Through the haze of pain, I heard them. Footsteps, voices, laughter. "ESL. Está muerto," one of them said. "It's him. He's dead." I lay still, my vision blurring, the sound of their retreating footsteps like a cruel mercy. The world began to fade, but I fought to stay conscious, clutching the hope that someone would find me. I don't remember much about the ride to the hospital. The sounds of sirens and voices blurred into one another, and every breath felt like a battle. When I finally woke up, I was in a sterile room, the sharp smell of antiseptic filling the air. A nurse stood nearby, her expression one of quiet urgency as she adjusted the four in my arm. But before I could say anything, the door opened, and a man I didn't recognize walked in. He was tall, dressed in a dark suit that seemed out of place here. His face was unreadable, but there was a sense of authority about him that made me uneasy. "Señor Lopez," he said, his voice calm but firm. "You're coming with me." I tried to protest, but he shook his head. "There's no time. They know you're here, and they'll be back to finish the job." I didn't have the strength to argue. Two other men entered the room, one carrying a stretcher. Before I knew it, they were wheeling me out, the nurse watching in stunned silence. The ride was a blur, the pain and exhaustion pulling me in and out of consciousness. I tried to piece together what was happening, but the only thing I knew for sure was that my life was about to change in ways I couldn't yet imagine. When I opened my eyes, the world felt distant, as if I were waking from a dream I couldn't escape. The room was dimly lit, the walls a soft gray, and the faint hum of machines was the only sound. My chest ached with every breath, a sharp reminder of the bullet that had nearly taken my life. "You're awake," a deep voice said, pulling me from my thoughts. I turned my head slowly, and there he was, a face I hadn't seen in years but knew all too well. "You," I croaked, my throat dry and voice weak. He nodded, his expression unreadable. With a flick of his hand, he gestured to the men standing near the door. "Leave us," he ordered. The room emptied quickly, the heavy door closing with a soft click. He pulled up a chair and sat beside the bed, leaning forward with his hands clasped together. "You've been out for 3 days," he said. "You were lucky. That bullet should have taken you out." I swallowed hard, trying to sit up, but the pain was too much. "Why are you here?" I managed to ask. His lips curled into a faint smile, one that didn't reach his eyes. "Because someone needs to remind the world who they're dealing with. You might have left that life behind, but your life has other plans." Over the next week, I remained in that hidden facility, recovering under his watch. He didn't say much at first, but I could sense that something was brewing. Men came and went, their movements precise and deliberate. Conversations were whispered, plans drawn out on maps. I recognized the signs of an operation in motion. He finally explained on the 4th day. "Enrique Valdez made a mistake," he said, his tone cold. "He thought he could take you out and walk away. He forgot that you're El Furras, the ferocious one. That name still carries weight, Gabriel. Enough to scare even the most powerful men. I shook my head, the nickname feeling like a relic from another life. I'm not that man anymore. I left it all behind. He leaned closer, his voice lowering. You might think you did, but the world doesn't forget. And neither do I. This isn't just about you. It's about sending a message. Enrique started this war. Now we're going to end it. A week later, the storm began. News spread quickly through the region. Enrique's empire was under attack. Safe houses were raided, drug shipments intercepted, and his men picked off one by one. No one knew who was behind it, but whispers grew louder with every hit. El Faraz is on the hunt. The message was clear, written in blood and fire. No one was safe, not even Enrique. I stayed in the shadows, watching as Raul's operation unfolded. I hadn't asked for this, but a part of me couldn't deny the satisfaction I felt knowing that justice, or something like it, was being served. Enrique had taken everything from me, and now he was paying the price. Enrique burst into the house like a man on fire, his face pale and glistening with sweat. He slammed the door behind him, locking it hastily before spinning around to face Patricia. His flamboyance had melted into fear, and the confident cartel boss now looked like a desperate man clinging to his last shred of control. "Where is he?" he demanded, his voice shaky, his chest heaving. Patricia stood in the living room, startled but unimpressed by his frantic state. "Where's who?" she asked, arms crossed, her voice tinged with annoyance. "Your husband," Enrique snapped, his voice rising in pitch. "Gabriel. Who the hell is he, Patricia? What have you gotten me into?" Patricia rolled her eyes and let out a mocking laugh. "Gabriel? Are you serious? He's nobody, Enrique. Just a shy little mechanic who made up some story about being a soldier to sound interesting. He's not dangerous. He's pathetic." Enrique's eyes darted around the room, his fear only deepening. "You don't understand," he hissed. "They're calling him the El Faraz. Do you know what that means? That's not a name you make up. El Faraz was a legend. He is a ruthless man. He almost wiped out the cartel from Baja, single-handedly." Patricia shook her head, dismissing his words with a wave of her hand. "You're paranoid. Gabriel couldn't hurt a fly. He's probably sulking in some bar, licking his wounds after I told him I was done with him." But Enrique wasn't convinced. He paced the room, muttering to himself, "They've hit every one of my safe houses. My men are gone. They left messages, warnings. El Faraz's name is written all over this. He's hunting me, Patricia, and now they'll come here." Patricia laughed again, a cruel, hollow sound. "You think my boring, useless husband is some kind of assassin? Please. You're losing it, Enrique." Before Enrique could respond, the sound of shattering glass and splintering would erupted from the back of the house. Both of them froze, the color draining from Patricia's face as masked men stormed into the room, moving with military precision. "Get down," one of them barked, his voice sharp and authoritative. Patricia screamed as two of the men grabbed her, pulling her hands behind her back. Enrique tried to run, but he didn't make it far. A single blow to the back of his head sent him sprawling to the floor. He whimpered as they hauled him to his knees, a gun pressed to his temple. "What do you want?" Enrique begged, his bravado completely gone. "I'll pay. Whatever you want, it's yours." The men didn't respond. Instead, one of them tilted his head toward Patricia, who was struggling against her captors. "Her too," he said simply. "No, you can't." Patricia's protests were cut off as a hood was pulled over her head, muffling her cries. In a matter of minutes, the house was silent again, the masked men disappearing into the night with their captives. The neighbors, too terrified to intervene, watched from their windows as the dark van sped away, leaving only broken glass and shattered furniture in its wake. For Enrique and Patricia, the nightmare was just beginning. Patricia's heart raced as she blinked against the dim light. Her surroundings slowly came into focus. A lavish dining room with a long wooden table polished to a shine. The air smelled faintly of roasted meat and herbs, but the aroma did little to calm her trembling nerves. Her wrists, which she expected to find bound, were free, and a woman dressed in a crisp, black uniform stood before her. "Sit properly," the woman said, her tone firm but not unkind. "Dinner is about to begin." Patricia, scared to death, complied without a word, straightening her posture as though her life depended on it. She glanced around, her mind racing. Where was Enrique? What was this place? And then her breath hitched as the door creaked open. Gabriel walked in. But this wasn't the quiet, unassuming man she had once mocked and betrayed. He was dressed in a sleek black commando uniform, his presence commanding, his movements precise and deliberate. He walked to the head of the table and sat down opposite her, his eyes sharp and unyielding. "Serve her," he said calmly, his voice cutting through the suffocating tension. The woman moved gracefully, placing a plate of food in front of Patricia. The aroma was intoxicating, but her fear dulled her appetite. She looked down at the plate, her hands shaking. "Eat," Gabriel said, his voice softer now but no less firm. Patricia hesitated, her mind screaming at her to refuse, but the weight of his gaze left no room for argument. She picked up the fork, taking small, hesitant bites. The food was exquisite, but it felt like ash in her mouth. "Gabriel," she started, her voice cracking. I'm sorry. Please, forgive me. I was wrong and—" He held up a hand, silencing her. "I don't want to know why you did it," he said, his tone devoid of emotion. "Your reasons don't matter to me." Patricia's lips quivered, tears pooling in her eyes. She wanted to explain, to justify, but his cold detachment left her words stuck in her throat. He leaned back slightly, observing her with a calmness that unnerved her. Then, in a stark contrast to the tension in the room, he gestured toward her plate. "How's the food?" he asked. She blinked, caught off guard by the question. It's good," she stammered, swallowing another bite despite the lump in her throat. Gabriel nodded, his gaze still fixed on her. "The meat is locally procured," he said, as if discussing the weather. "Fresh, tender. The cook here knows how to bring out the best in it." Patricia nodded mutely, not knowing what to say. She had expected anger, screaming, accusations, but this was something entirely different, something that scared her more than anything she had imagined. As the minutes ticked by, Gabriel continued to talk about the food, the preparation, the seasoning, as if they were having an ordinary dinner conversation. Patricia tried to keep up, answering his questions when prompted, but her fear only grew with each passing moment. Whatever Gabriel had planned, she knew it wasn't going to end with dessert. Gabriel leaned forward slightly, his piercing gaze locked onto Patricia's trembling form. His tone remained calm, almost conversational, as he gestured toward her plate. "You know, Patricia," he began, "Mexico is a country where nothing goes to waste. We are resourceful, especially when it comes to food. It's a lesson passed down through generations, to respect what we have, to use every part of what's given to us." Patricia froze, the fork halfway to her lips, her stomach twisting with unease. Her eyes flickered down to the plate, then back to Gabriel, searching his face for answers she wasn't sure she wanted. "The cook," he continued, his voice steady, "put a lot of effort into this meal. Made sure everything was prepared perfectly. Every piece cooked just right." He tilted his head slightly, a faint smile curling at the corners of his lips. Patricia's fork clattered onto the plate as her hands began to shake uncontrollably. What are you saying?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. Gabriel leaned back in his chair, his expression as cold and unyielding as steel. "I'm saying, Patricia, that Enrique has been served to you with the utmost care. He won't be needing what's left of him where he's going. But you? I thought you might appreciate one last meal together." Patricia's breath came in shallow gasps as the room spun around her. She pushed the plate away, while rising in her throat, but Gabriel's voice cut through her panic like a knife. "Hopefully," he said, his voice almost kind now, "he'll keep you full for your next journey, wherever that may take you." Tears streamed down her face as she sobbed uncontrollably, her entire body trembling. Gabriel stood up, adjusting his uniform with precision. "I warned you, Patricia," he said, his voice devoid of emotion. "You played with fire, and now you're burning." Without another word, he turned and walked out of the room, leaving her alone with the plate in front of her, the grotesque reality of her choices staring back at her. Gabriel's footsteps echoed down the hall as he exited the room, leaving Patricia trembling at the table. But before she could fully process the overwhelming dread that had gripped her, another presence filled the doorway. A man stepped in, tall and lean, his eyes wide with manic energy. He smiled, a chilling, almost deranged smile, as he slowly approached her, his every movement deliberate, as though he were savoring the moment. Well, he said in a tone laced with amusement. "How was the food?" Patricia, still frozen in fear, looked up at him. Her heart hammered in her chest, and for the first time, she couldn't find her voice. The smile on his face seemed to stretch impossibly wide, his teeth gleaming like a predator's. "I cooked it myself," he continued, his voice dripping with satisfaction. "I thought you'd appreciate the care that went into it." Patricia recoiled as her stomach churned. She felt the bile rise in her throat, but before she could speak, the man leaned in closer, his grin never faltering. "Oh, by the way," he said with a casual flick of his wrist, "my name is Santiago Meza Lopez. You've probably heard of me. My cousin, Gabriel? He's the head of my cartel's assault division now. He's very efficient." Patricia's mind raced, trying to piece together the horrifying reality of what was happening. Gabriel, her husband, the man she had betrayed, was not the man she thought he was. She had no idea who he really was, and now his cousin, Santiago, was standing in front of her, taunting her with the knowledge of how deeply entangled she had become with people far darker than she could have ever imagined. Santiago's gaze never wavered as he studied her reaction. His smile was like a razor blade, sharp, knowing, and utterly unrepentant. It was clear to him that Patricia, in her desperation and naivety, had never understood the depths of the world she had been dragged into. "You didn't just cheat on Gabriel," Santiago mused, his tone almost conversational now. "You crossed into a world where there are no second chances, no easy outs." He took a step back, his eyes gleaming with dark amusement. "And you, my dear, will never get another chance." Patricia's breath hitched in her throat, and for the first time, she understood the cold, ruthless truth of what she had done. Her fate had already been sealed, and there was no turning back now. Santiago let the silence linger for a moment, savoring her terror, before turning on his heel. "Enjoy the rest of your meal," he called over his shoulder, his voice now carrying a note of finality. "It's the last thing you'll ever taste." And with that, he disappeared into the shadows, leaving Patricia alone in the dark, the weight of her choices settling over her like a tomb. Patricia's body was discovered a week later, unceremoniously dumped along the harsh, unforgiving stretch of the U.S.-Mexico border. The remnants of her life, her passport, her ID card, her belongings, were placed deliberately around her body, a grim gesture to ensure she would be identified. The authorities who found her knew the signs all too well. The state of her remains told a story that didn't need words, a story of betrayal, violence, and a swift, merciless end. They did what they could to preserve any evidence, though it was clear that whatever had happened to her was already sealed in the shadows. Her parents, devastated and broken by the news, identified her body in a small, sterile room at a morgue on the outskirts of the city. Their grief was palpable, their disbelief raw. The woman who had been their daughter was now a cold, lifeless reminder of the consequences of her choices. Patricia's parents arranged a quiet funeral back in her hometown, a small, somber ceremony attended only by family and a few close friends. There were no grand gestures, no extravagant tributes. It was just the simple, quiet rituals of a family mourning the loss of a loved one, albeit one whose decisions had led her down a dark, irreversible path. Her grave, now nestled in the quiet cemetery, was marked with a simple stone, the name Patricia carved into the cold, gray surface. The town, too small to forget, had already moved on. Those who knew her now whispered about her brief life, her betrayal, and the man she had once loved, though no one ever spoke of Gabriel in the same breath again. The story of Patricia, in the end, was nothing more than a cautionary tale, a reminder that, sometimes, the price for playing with fire is one that can't be avoided. Dear listeners, please share your thoughts in the comments section below, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.